Hey guys, and welcome back to the Spruce and Linen channel. I'm Janelle, and today we're going to talk a little bit about ends per inch, or EPI, and warp set. So we're not going to get super technical with this because the type of weaving I teach you here on the YouTube channel, we simply don't really need to get overly technical, but I just want to show you a few different things that kind of dictate what type of weaving that you're making and the best warp set to use depending on what you're trying to make. So let's get started. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your ends per inch and your warp set. Something that's a little bit different on these becca looms versus our flat pack frame loom is that these notches are slightly closer together. So on the becca loom, when you do a single warp, you're going to have 5 ends per inch, or 5 warp strings per inch. On our flat pack frame looms, we have 4 ends per inch. So it's a little bit further apart and it's what I'm used to, but I'm gonna actually show you how you can get 4 ends per inch even on a loom like this. First things first, we're gonna actually start with a double warp. So I'm gonna start way over here at this end, and I'm going to put 2 strings in each notch. Okay, so now you can see we have this little warp on here, and this is actually going to give you 10 ends per inch because we did 2 strings in each notch on a 5 ends per inch loom. So this is the set that you're going to want to use if you're doing something like a bracelet. And we're going to talk a little bit about the different effects that each of these have. And we're going to do a worsted weight yarn, a nice extra chunky yarn, and then some cotton rope. And I'm just gonna weave these in plain weave so that you can see the difference in each section. Okay, so now we have this double warp on, and you can see the difference with using different materials on a super tight together warp. So if you were making something like a bracelet, this is what you would want to use. So everything's really close together. You're gonna get a tighter woven cloth here, so less spaces between everything. And this is a fairly balanced weave, meaning the amount of warp strings to the amount of weft strings is pretty much equal. Up here, we're starting to get a little bit crowded. You can definitely see all those warp strings, and then up here that's even emphasized more. So it's just really overcrowded with that warp in there. It's not sitting the best, but if that's the look you're going for, that could be used as well. Next, we're going to do a single warp. Now we have a single warp on the loom. So this is 1 string per notch. And on this loom, again, that is 5 strings per inch. So now we're gonna look at what these 3 different weights of yarn look like on a single warp. So now we can look at the difference that all these same weights of yarn look like on a wider warp or a smaller EPI, meaning there's less strings per inch here than here. So here we have 10 strings per inch, and here we have 5. So on this bottom one, now that we're using this really thin weft string on a widespread warp, you can no longer see the warp strings once you pack it down. So this would be what's normal in traditional tapestry, where you're just not gonna see the warp strings, whereas this is more of a balanced cloth. And then up here on this set, this is more of a balanced cloth, whereas here it was really crowded. Here it's getting closer to being balanced, even though the weights of the warp and the weft aren't the same. We're getting a little bit closer to the same ends per inch. And then up here, we have a better balanced cloth as well. It's still a little bit crowded because this rope is really thick, but versus this, you know, this is looking a little bit more balanced. So now we're going to do what I'm used to weaving on, which is a 4 ends per inch. And I wanted to show you how you can do this, even though these notches are set for 5 ends per inch. So all you're gonna do is you're gonna start warping just the same way. If I can get my loop here. What we're going to do in this case is every 3rd string, we're going to skip a notch. So we're gonna warp 3. Now that we have 3 on, we're going to skip 1 notch and go to the next. You're just going to continue grouping your warp strings, and every time you have 3, you're going to skip a notch. So now we have these little groups of 3, and you might be looking at this and thinking, but now it's not evenly warped, and that is true. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to use a twining stitch to spread out the warp evenly. If you like this set, you can just go with this, but since I'm bringing in these new looms and I'm used to that 4 strings per inch, and I often like to use it, especially when you're wanting to use really chunky yarns or weave with roving, I find that that 4 ends per inch set is basically perfect for that. So that's why I wanted to show you how you can do this. So I'm gonna just put a quick twine stitch in here. And as we're putting the twining in, we're going to allow it to help us evenly spread out this warp. So you can see here I'm just kind of adjusting the strings so they're a little bit more even. And then you can do the same thing at the top. Now you can see we have this nice spread out warp with that 4 ends per inch. Now, if I was doing an actual woven wall hanging, I would probably just spread out the warp at the bottom, weave, and then when I got to the top, I would do this twining stitch, but I just wanted to show you what it looks like when you can just even out those warp strings with the twining stitch at the top and the bottom. So as you can see, this solves the problem of, and it's not really a problem, but if you like that 4 ends per inch, this is a way that you can do that even though these notches are closer together. And this loom, and what I love about it is it's so versatile. You can see we have 3 completely different sets on one loom. So now I'm going to go in and weave these same yarns into this 4 ends per inch warp. Now we can compare all 3 different warp sets with the different yarns. So again, we have 10 ends per inch, 5 ends per inch, and 4 ends per inch. And you can really start to see the difference between these. These 2 are pretty similar, but you can definitely see that everything's packed together a little closer in this one versus this one. Same up here. And down here is where we really notice the difference with the thin yarn. So that's a more balanced cloth. This is definitely a weft face cloth, as is this. The main difference just being that the little bumps of the warp are closer together here versus here. Now, depending on what project you're working on will depend on the warp set that you're going to want to use. If you're wanting to make a bracelet, then I would go with this tighter warp set because it's going to be a tighter woven together cloth, and that's what you want for a bracelet, something that you're wearing. Then you can get finer detail. You could definitely do like a diamond twill, that diamond twill pattern that you can get by signing up for our email list. You can do that here on a bracelet with a thinner yarn, and the diamonds will be much smaller versus here, if you have a wider spread out warp and a chunky yarn, those diamonds are going to be much bigger. You can kind of think of your weaving as a grid. So if you did do our diamond twill video and you got the pattern, you'll notice it's like on a grid paper pattern. So you can think of your warp as pixels. Now, the more pixels, the finer the detail. So here, we can pack in more strings with a thin yarn and a close set together warp. So we'll get more detail out of this set. And then moving up to here, it's like a more pixelated photo. So everything is a little bit wider spread and bigger. So the diamond, so if you were doing diamond twill, those diamonds would be really big. Over here, the diamonds would be really small. So I hope that helps you understand the different things that you can do here. Most importantly, I wanted to show you that you can use any loom to get any set, really, in this case of a frame loom. So on a floor loom, you would use different reeds, which have little different slots spread further or closer together. But on a frame loom, all we have to work with is these notches, and you know, you might not have 5 different looms with the notches spread 5 different ways. So this is a way that you can kind of get different effects depending on what you're wanting to make. All right, you guys, so there is 3 different warp sets with 3 different weights of yarn, just so you can get an idea of what those things look like together. So you can really kind of decide what kind of weaving you want to make based on this. I'm so excited that we now have these Becca looms in the shop, so go check it out. The link is in the description box below. If you like this video, please hit that like button, subscribe, and click the bell to get notifications when I post new videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Double clap. Deal with it. All right.